Hello, everybody. Welcome to our first video on the endocrine system. So this is an introductory video kind of going over some terminology that we're going to see with the endocrine system, some general foundational ideas that will be repeated throughout all of the different endocrine organs, and finishing up with hypothalamic control because the hypothalamus regulates pituitary, and the pituitary is a very complex endocrine structure. So that will be one of our first endocrine videos after this intro. But before we get to kind of diagrams and stuff, in the notes it talks about some vocabulary words with cell communication, intercellular communication. So intercellular is between cells. So you may have learned this back in your Bio 211 class when we cover cell communication, or it may be brand new. So I'm just going to go through all of this to kind of bring everybody up to the same page. So there is listed 5 different types of intercellular communication. So I just want to go through those pretty quickly. So the first type is direct. Okay, so direct communication is cells are touching each other. So cell to cell communications. So let's say you have a cell here and you have a cell here, and they might have a gap junction between. And so they can have their substances communicate back and forth between this direct cell connection. Okay. Next we have paracrine. We don't really see paracrine too much in our discussions, but it is like a local neighboring result communications. Let's say we have a few cells in a tissue kind of hanging out, right? So here's some cuboidal cells, and let's say one cell releases a chemical. And then all of these cells have receptors that will respond to that chemical. Think paracrine is local, like your neighborhood. It's not direct contact because this cell is not touching these cells. It's a local chemical messenger that's going to be landing on a receptor of its neighbors. Autocrine. Okay, so autocrine, I don't think I'm going to fit all of these on here without erasing. So let's say you are a cell and you have a receptor on your cell surface, and you release your chemical and it comes around and it stimulates your own receptor. So this is autocrine cell. Okay, smooth muscle can do this. They can release a chemical messenger, come back and stimulate themselves. Synaptic, so I'm going to have to erase, let's erase direct here. So we should be super familiar with synaptic, right? Oops, so we have one neuron communicating to another neuron at the synapse. So it's releasing neurotransmitter, crossing that synaptic cleft, binding to the receptor, affecting that postsynaptic cell. So we are pros at synaptic communication. The last one that we're going to take a look at is what this whole chapter is covering is endocrine. So, ooh, that's a lot of dots to try to erase. So endocrine is it's like paracrine, but paracrine was local. Endocrine is long distance. So you're going to have your cell be producing its chemical message. Your target cells are going to be usually far away, but it doesn't have to be far away. But the dealio for this is the chemical reaches its target via the blood supply. So let's say here's the chemical message, which we call hormones. It goes into the bloodstream. The hormone travels to the bloodstream and then exits somewhere and binds the receptor at that target tissue or target cell. So that is, oh, and I didn't write the name. This was our endocrine messaging. So the key to endocrine is your chemical messenger enters the bloodstream to travel to the target tissue, where direct and this is all chemical messaging, right? So chemical messengers are across the board. Direct connection, the chemical messenger travels to the gap junction. Paracrine, the chemical messenger travels through the interstitial fluid around the local neighborhood. Autocrine, chemical messenger comes right back to the signaling cell. Synaptic communication, the chemical goes across the synapse. Endocrine, the chemical goes into the bloodstream. And these are the target cells. So you might hear target cells, target tissues, but we know tissues are made up of cells. So the targets can be close by, or they could be very far away, but either way, the endocrine messenger, the hormone, goes into the bloodstream to get to the target. And the reason what makes the target is because it's going to have a receptor for that particular molecule. So if my little purple blobs here are the receptor for the blue hormone, it will trigger that cell to respond. But if our target tissue does not have the messenger for the blue hormone, it has got a different kind of messenger, so in this case, the green blob, that target cell with the green receptor is not going to respond to the blue hormone because it doesn't fit. So the target tissues are target because they have the receptors that will recognize that signaling molecule, the hormone. Okay, so make sure you're comfortable with target tissues, hormones, and endocrine signaling, and know the difference between those other types that we have seen in prior chapters or will be seeing in other future chapters. Okay, so just an overview. So this is there at the beginning of the chapter. Just wanted to show you some of the organs of the endocrine system, and they are widely distributed around the body. So it's not like one specific location you're going to find endocrine organs or tissues. And you'll also notice some of them are associated with other body systems. So some key ones that we have already seen are found in the brain, which was part of our nervous system, but they also carry out endocrine functions as well. So the pineal gland secretes melatonin, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are all associated with brain structure, but they do produce and secrete quite a few hormones. The other organs that are listed in purple with a little purple highlight, those are, well, with the exception of this one, I'm going to put asterisks there, are purely endocrine. So thyroid gland only does endocrine. Adrenal glands only do endocrine. Parathyroid glands only do endocrine. The asterisk is next to the pancreas. Well, they're saying pancreatic islets, I guess. That's fine. If it was the whole pancreas, then no, because there's a lot of exocrine function with the pancreas. With pancreatic islets, yes, they are purely endocrine. But when we take a look at these other ones, we have the heart, which is clearly part of the cardiovascular system, but it releases a couple hormones. We have the thymus, which is part of the lymphatic system, but it releases hormones. Adipose tissue is all over the place, but it can release a hormone. The digestive tract, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, they all are part of the digestive system, but they release hormones. The kidney is part of the urinary system, but it releases hormones. And your gonads, ovaries and testes, are part of the reproductive system, but they also release hormones. So again, we have organs that are specific to endocrine function, and we also have organs that are usually well known for another function, like the heart is for pumping blood, but it does have some endocrine function. So just keep that in mind, and we're going to be going through, spending most of our time on these purple highlighted organs of the endocrine system, but I will talk about some of these other organs. All right. Okay, so this next slide is kind of just introducing the different molecular types of hormones we have based on their kind of molecular foundation. And I don't need you to like memorize or know which one is which necessarily, unless I specifically need you to know that. But the big divider is these two separate from this one. Okay. So amino acid derivatives and peptide hormones are hydrophilic, and these ones, the lipid derivatives, are what do you think? Phobic. Okay, so that's a big deal because it's going to determine where those hormones bind to the receptors. So amino acid derivatives, amino acids, remember, are small carbon-based molecules. They're the subunit of long protein chains. And so things like thyroid hormones, epinephrine, melatonin, those are some examples of amino acid derivatives. And you can see they're, a relatively smallish organic molecule, maybe 10 or so carbons, some oxygens, hydrogens, a few nitrogens might be thrown in there. Compare that to peptide hormones. Peptides are chains of amino acids. So they might be glycoproteins, 200 amino acids long. Things like oxytocin and ADH might be like 9 amino acids or 50 amino acids or 100 amino acids. So, so amino acid chains. So if each one of these, that could be a polypeptide or a peptide hormone where amino acid derivative would just be like one circle. So size differences, but they're both hydrophilic because they're charged, they're polar molecules, they cannot diffuse through that phospholipid bilayer. Compare that to the hydrophobic lipid derivatives. These can be made from different kinds of fats and steroids. So eicosanoids, we can kind of see those right here. Prostaglandin E, which is a paracrine, sometimes hormone, usually a paracrine factor, and steroid hormones, so estrogen, testosterone, aldosterone, corticosteroids like cortisol. So those are based on that 4-ring pattern of a steroid molecule with different functional groups that are sticking off of it. But again, the key for these, the eicosanoids and the steroid hormones, they are lipid soluble and they can diffuse through the plasma membrane to reach the receptors inside of the cell. And that's kind of where we're heading to next. So if you are in a hormone in those first two categories, the amino acid derivative or the peptide hormone, you are hydrophilic. You are large, you are water soluble, you're polar, you cannot diffuse to the phospholipid bilayer. So your receptor has to be located on the surface because that's the only way that you're going to communicate to the cell. So this is a slide that just shows 3 different examples of these potential receptors. So all 3 of these are G protein examples. So we saw G proteins back with our alpha, beta, and muscarinic receptors in chapter 16. We saw some G proteins associated with smell and taste. Here, G proteins, we have ones that are going to result in increased cyclic AMP, which is our second messenger, usually excitatory for the cell. Here's one that breaks down cyclic AMP, which would decrease the functional or inhibit the cell. And here's another one that's kind of uses calcium as a second messenger, which then will help to activate enzymes. So this slide, again, the takeaway message, I don't want you to memorize all of these things or know which one is which, but it's more of the idea that do you understand that when you have a hydrophilic molecule, it has to bind to the surface receptor and trigger a second messenger cascade inside of the cell. Okay, so those 2 slides are kind of combining together to give you that understanding of the molecular nature of the hormone will tell you clues as to the receptor and vice versa. So if you're talking about a receptor for a hormone that's on the surface of the cell, it will likely be a peptide derivative or a polypeptide, a protein chain. It'll be hydrophobic. Gosh, I keep getting those mixed up today, hydrophilic. So here's just some examples. Again, like I said, you don't have to memorize these, but it's kind of nice to bring in prior knowledge knowing, okay, so when we talk about alpha-1 receptors, they are going to bind to their protein receptor, activate their G protein, and it's going to be a calcium-based second messenger for the alpha-1 receptors. For alpha-2, remember alpha-2s were inhibitory, voila, breaking down cyclic AMP, that's an inhibitory function. Okay, that makes sense. You can kind of start building on some of the knowledge that we learned back in chapter 16. Okay, so this kind of style of cell surface receptor is just the one way. So this is surface reception. For those lipid soluble ones, like your steroid hormones, or in this case, thyroid hormone also is lipid soluble. It does not need its receptor on the surface of the cell because of that hydrophobic nature. It's soluble in lipids. It can diffuse right through that plasma membrane. That's the nature of hydrophobic molecules. So you can have receptors in the cytoplasm, right? So here we have that step 2 is the hormone diffuses into the cell, binds the receptor. Sometimes the receptor could be in the nucleus already and the hormone has to go all the way into the nucleus, but either way, you're going to get this complex of the hormone and the receptor collectively together, goes into the nucleus, acts as a gene regulator, activating transcription and then translation, and then that's how you're going to get your cell's response. You might be triggering the production of an enzyme or triggering a secretory product whatever the gene was coding for. So usually your lipid-soluble hormones are going to be affecting gene expression, turning on genes, turning off genes. That action is going to take place in the nucleus, and the cell will respond in that way. For the thyroid hormone that they have here on this other example, this does have intracellular receptors. It is more of a transport across the plasma membrane than a diffusion, but they included this thyroid hormone in this message because the receptor is inside. There's two locations for receptors for the thyroid hormone. One is it is on the mitochondria, and the other one that it would be in the nucleus. When the thyroid hormone binds to the receptor on the mitochondria, it increases the activity of the mitochondria, producing a whole bunch of ATP. So that's your knowledge of what mitochondria do for cell bio. For the thyroid hormone going into the nucleus, it will bind to the receptor. Again, it will do this whole gene expression pathway to produce the cell's response. So we have intracellular receptors for lipid-soluble hormones as well as the thyroid hormone. Okay, the next thing we're going to take a look at is how are hormones triggered to be released. Okay, so endocrine reflexes is the section in the book that this is covering. So again, remember the idea of a reflex is you have a stimulus show up and you have a response given off. I guess that's the best way to say it. So in this case, there's different stimuli. There's different ways that the hormone can be triggered to be released. So you're thinking of this endocrine organ. All right, so I am the thyroid gland. I am the pituitary gland. Something is going to arrive, or I'm going to monitor, or I'm going to recognize this stimuli, and that is going to trigger my response of releasing a hormone. So the three types of stimuli that can trigger hormone release are what's called humoral, hormonal, and neural. So I'm going to give you some examples to walk through, very kind of schematic looking examples. So humoral refers to fluids, primarily your blood. So blood levels of things are going to trigger the release of a particular hormone. So let's take a look at an example. So for the parathyroid gland, right? So your parathyroid gland, your thyroid gland sits here. The parathyroid gland are four little bean-shaped glands that sit on the back side of the thyroid gland. So para meaning around. It is a humoral stimuli triggered gland, and its job is to release the hormone called parathyroid hormone. And if you remember, we learned about PTH back in chapter 6 when we were looking at bone maintenance and blood calcium regulation. Well, let's say you have low blood calcium, right? So low blood calcium. There are these cells, the endocrine releasing cells in the parathyroid gland that are monitoring the blood, right? So say you have goggles, right? I'm a parathyroid gland cell. I'm looking at the blood. There's a capillary. I'm kind of monitoring the calcium. When it gets below the normal acceptable range, I think it was like 8.5 milligrams per deciliter. So if it gets below that, they're like, bing, 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 buzzer goes off saying, okay, calcium levels are too low. I'm going to start secreting parathyroid into the bloodstream because, right, it's a hormone. So that's what it's got to do. So the PTH goes and does its job. And if you remember the job of the PTH, parathyroid hormone, it goes and targets your osteoclasts to increase their activity to break down the bone matrix, releasing blood calcium. It targets your digestive viscera to help increase the absorption of calcium. And it targets your kidneys to hold on to any calcium that's going through the filtrate so we do not pee out the calcium and we can retain that for our blood levels. Blood levels will go back up. The monitoring cells are saying, okay, blood levels are back to normal. So then they turn it off. And then they do not release the PTH anymore because the blood calcium levels are back to normal. And then everything's fine, but then they're still monitoring. So when the blood levels go back low again, they'll respond and they'll release more PTH. Remember, that's that dynamic equilibrium idea, negative feedback. When things go low, you change something to bring that back up. When things get high, you do something to bring the levels back down to normal to stay within that acceptable range. Okay, so when you have changing blood levels of something, that is going to be called humoral stimuli. So this is true for blood calcium, blood sodium, blood potassium, pretty much all your blood levels of ions. It could be maybe blood pressure, blood pH. Those could also be considered humoral stimuli that might trigger the release of hormones based on the blood composition. Right. The next one is called hormonal. It is an organ that releases a hormone in response to the arrival of another hormone. And before I click the next thing, there's a word that goes along with this is called tropic. I know it looks like tropic, but it's a long O. Tropic. So a tropic hormone is one that is released by the arrival of another hormone, which is basically the definition of hormonal stimuli. So when we go through all of the different hormones, I'll try to point out which ones are humoral, which ones are hormonal, and which ones are neural. So let's take a look at the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland is the one that sits right here, right? We just talked about the parathyroid sitting behind. The thyroid gland sits here. Usually you get that palpated during a checkup. The thyroid gland releases thyroid hormone, right? T3, T4. But it only does that when there is arrival of another hormone. So the pituitary gland, which kind of sits dangling from your infundibulum, right? So your pituitary gland releases a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland travels through its bloodstream, targets the thyroid gland, and the thyroid gland says, wow, okay, so TSH is landing on my receptor. It's telling me to release my thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone goes out to the bloodstream and targets all your tissues to respond to the need for T3, T4. So hormonal stimuli is a endocrine gland releases its hormone by the arrival of another hormone, and that's that definition of tropic. Okay. The next one is neural. And I had to change my little shape so my head didn't completely cover it. We are familiar with neural stimuli. We just spent a ton of chapters talking about neurons and how they fire and how they signal. So I use the example of sympathetic activation for neural stimuli. So in this case, the hormones that are coming from the suprarenal medulla are epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? So these guys, remember those were hormones that got released into the bloodstream. They didn't come from at a synapse. So hypothalamic sympathetic activation, fight or flight or exercise, fight or flight or freeze or exercise, sends that long preganglionic neuron all the way to the suprarenal medulla, triggering that modified postganglionic endocrine cell to release the epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream, which will then go and communicate with the rest of the tissues. Okay, because it's a hormone, it's not a neurotransmitter. It is a hormone when it gets dumped into the bloodstream. All right, so again, I will try to remember to point out whether the hormones or the glands that we're talking about are triggered humorally, hormonally, and neurally. Sometimes it's more than one, so we'll also try to address that as well. Okay. All right, the last thing we're going to cover in this introductory lecture is general hypothalamic control. How does the hypothalamus regulate primarily the pituitary on the adrenal medulla, because the pituitary is such a huge deal. And we're going to talk about it a little bit more in the pituitary gland video as well. So when we are talking about how the hypothalamus controls other endocrine organs, there's three major ways. The hypothalamus is an endocrine organ itself, which is this first one here. So ADH and oxytocin are produced by those nuclei in the hypothalamus that are then released into the bloodstream coming from the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Again, we're going to see this again because it overlaps with the pituitary gland. But these hormones are made in the hypothalamus, secreted from the posterior lobe. The second way, and this is a huge way, is there are cells, particularly if you remember the tuberal area, because here's the mammary gland. So cells in this tuberal area of the hypothalamus produce regulatory hormones that go down and regulate 7 of the hormones that are secreted from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Okay, and then lastly, we just talked about this with our neurostimulation, is sympathetic activation in that sympathetic nuclei within the hypothalamus sends those preganglionic fibers all the way to the adrenal medulla, releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream. All right, so those are 3 ways that the hypothalamus confers control on various endocrine mechanisms. We are going to be talking more about this, especially these first 2, because it really impacts the pituitary gland when we talk about the pituitary gland. All right. And that is what we're going to do next. So I will say goodbye to you and see you next time. Bye.